McCarthy, and I'm the president of the Bioethics Society of Boston College. I do want to start by thanking the BC Career Center for helping us to put on the event, and thank you to all of you watching for tuning in virtually. We have over 60 attendees already. Tonight, we have 3 great panelists here with us tonight to discuss the medical school interview process with a special focus on virtual interviewing and ethics-related questions. Our first panelist is Dr. Kristen Goodell, Associate Dean of Admissions at Boston University School of Medicine, and she has also served on the Harvard Medical School Admissions Committee since 2014. And she is the Director for Innovation and Medical Education at the Harvard Medical School's Center for Primary Care. Our second panelist is Kanwal Ojha. Kanwal graduated from Boston College in 2019 and is now a medical student at Tulane University School of Medicine. Our third panelist is Kayla, Pelland, the Assistant Director of Career Education and a Science, Technology, and Engineering Coach for the BC Career Center. Each panelist will now present for 10 to 15 minutes, and if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A feature on Zoom, and we'll read some of those in the last 20 minutes. Okay, Dr. Goodell, when you are ready, you can begin.
All right, very good. Hi, everybody. I am delighted that you're here. I think it's really impressive that so many of you are here at 7 p.m. I know that you're in college, but still, I don't know. I feel like it's a lot of Zoom these days. So anyway, so I have a couple of slides that I thought I would go through really quickly to kind of give some basic background. The first, I'll just tell you the kinds of things I'm going to cover in the next 10 minutes. First, I'm going to talk about who we are, which includes me, but also more importantly includes Boston University School of Medicine. It's true that I used to be on the Harvard Admissions Committee and also was the education director at the Center for Primary Care. But now actually my whole job is to work at Boston Medical Center and BU School of Medicine. Most of my time is taken up being the Associate Dean of Admissions, and then also I see patients. I'm a primary care doctor, and also I teach medical students specifically in our clinical skills course. So I'm going to talk a minute about what the amazing and wonderful things we do at BU School of Medicine, because this is like my chance to slip in an advertisement. Then though, I'm going to talk specifically about interviews and why must we torture you in this manner with these interviews. And then I'll try and give you some insight. I'm going to share the double secret instructions that we give interviewers. And I'm going to also talk about what questions we ask in interviews and some of the rationale for why. And then I just wrote here at the bottom, ask me all the questions, because I really think this will be more interesting if I'm answering your guys' questions. And you will discover that I have a minor candor problem. And if I have the answer to a question, then it's like impossible for me not to answer it, even if sometimes I would rather not. So I will basically answer whatever. I'm quite open about that. Okay, so who we are. We are, first of all, right down the street from you. The thing to know about Boston University School of Medicine is that we are a social justice medical school. That is how we stand out from the other medical schools in the United States, but especially in the Northeast. In the Northeast, we are really, what we do is social justice. And we do that in a million ways. We take care of an incredibly diverse patient population, come from absolutely everywhere. Our patients speak so many different languages that more than 70 different languages per day are spoken on average. About a third of our patients don't speak English as their primary language, just to give you a hint of the diversity that I'm talking about. We are a social justice medical school because we take care of patients paying really close attention to the context of their lives, right? So like, what is the way that people live and how can we help them? This is a photo that was taken after a patient of ours and her family received support for housing and support for improved nutrition, because these were things that were really impacting her toddler who had a lot of special needs. We also are advocates. And so this is a photo that was taken, earlier this summer, right after George Floyd's murder, and kind of at the peak of this sort of groundswell of Black Lives Matter. And we had basically a hospital kind of, not a walkout because the hospital supported it, but all of us kind of went out and took a knee and made sure that everyone was aware of what our kind of beliefs were. We also are people that practice frontline medicine. And like, okay, so what does frontline medicine mean? Well, some of it is the social justice work that I was talking about, but it also means that we train doctors who are going to roll up their sleeves and get to work solving the biggest problems for the neediest people. That looks like a whole lot of different things. Sometimes it looks like providing clinical care in the hospital. Sometimes it means doing research, for example, research on COVID-19 that was done at the National Emerging Infectious Diseases Laboratory. That's a photo from the Biosafety Level 4 lab, and it is actually a photo of people doing COVID research. Sometimes, though, it also means reaching out to people that are really far away. So we do a lot of global health. Our students are really interested in global health work. Look at that. I knew my motion sensor lights were going to be a problem. And so that photo is from our clinic in Lesotho, which is a tiny little country all surrounded by South Africa. We have our own clinics that we operate in Lesotho, in Ecuador, and in Vietnam. Okay, so I will stop with that, but feel free to ask me questions afterwards. I wanted to talk for a minute about interviews and basically like why are we torturing you and making you get extremely nervous and put on a suit and, you know, try and have a conversation that must feel frightening because it's evaluative and also kind of stilted and weird. Well, there are a bunch of different things. And, you know, these are the goals that I actually share with our admissions committee members. So we just started our interviews last week. And so right before that, we had training for the admissions committee, and this was what I told them the goals of the interview are. And so I figured I'd share them with you. Number one, and a pretty important part is just to make sure that people have reasonable communication skills. So it doesn't mean that you have to have the world's most scintillating conversation with your interviewer and they have to be like all excited and so thrilled to see you again. But actually, part of the job of being a doctor is to go into a room with a stranger and have a conversation, kind of an intimate personal conversation about 20 times a day. So it's sort of like a little bit of a skills, you know, it's like a skills thing too, in addition to just being conversation. We also use the interview to clarify, and a lot of it is to clarify things that are in your application. So for us, we're trying to find out, are you a good fit for us? You know, do you believe in helping the biggest people with the neediest problems? Is that something you're excited about? Sometimes we're trying to understand your motivation for medicine and how you made that decision. And then also just the path that you've taken to get there. Now, a lot of these things hopefully come through on your application, but part of what we can do in the interview is just to get a little bit of a better sense of some of it. So some people are amazing at explaining or amazing at painting themselves in a way that makes them a great fit for BU School of Medicine. But then I'm a little worried about like why they want to be doctors and not why they're not doing something else to change the world, right? So that comes up sometimes. And also the path you've taken. So lots of times people have had, you know, twists and turns in their path to medicine. They took time off after college. They worked, you know, jobs and had research opportunities that sometimes overlapped with other things. And so a lot of times we're just trying to figure out where people were and what they were doing in the various years since they've been thinking about applying to medical school. We also want to evaluate your ability to think critically, and that's where we ask questions about an ethical dilemma, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then we also want to, we probe any weaknesses in the application, and that sounds really mean, but actually, first of all, a lot of times these are not really weaknesses. And second of all, sometimes we're giving you a chance to explain something. So like if you had a semester where your grades took a dip, we usually just ask you about it. But what happened there, you know? And then the other thing, and I don't know if you guys know this, is that the other part of the reason that we're doing this is we're trying to recruit you, right? So we want to find the best possible students that we can. And so you will probably find yourselves in the position where somebody seems like they're selling their school to you. And that's a good thing. It means they like you and they hope that you decide to go there. Okay, so as I said, the goals I just shared with you for the interview are the goals that we share with the interviewers. But then I thought I would also just show you, sometimes people want to know about the seedy underbelly of admission. So I thought I would just show you like the double secret instructions for interviewers, because maybe this is interesting. So first of all of your application material is strictly confidential. So admissions committee members are not allowed to talk about it, not to anybody. And that includes, you know, people that might be trying to act on your behalf. So if you have got a professor who knows somebody on somebody's medical school's admissions committee, and maybe they'll like email or talk to their friend and say, hey, do you know what's happening with, Mary Smith's application? And the admissions committee member says, oh, I'm sure it'll get a thorough review. And that's because they're not allowed to spill the beans like that. It's a legal requirement, so people know, that you have to, anyone on an admissions committee has to disclose any relationship they have to any applicants to whoever is in charge. For our school, it's me. And that's because we don't want it to be that if you happen to be the, like whatever, like if your next door neighbor is on the admissions committee at so-and-so medical school, we don't actually want that to be a big factor in giving some people an advantage over others. So we make the committee disclose all of those relationships to me, and then I make sure that those admissions committee members are not part of the discussion regarding those specific applicants. If people happen to have a first-degree relative that's applying one year, they have to step off the committee. So that's if someone's kid is applying, or their spouse or sibling, something like that. Also, there are things that we tell our interviewers not to ask about. And these include things like age, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, income, disability status, all sorts of things. Now that's tricky because sometimes people write about those things in their application, and for good reason they do. But we try to, and so sometimes if you've written about it in your application, those topics will come up, but we really try to stay away from asking direct questions, which is because we don't want, we don't want to introduce any possible bias, right? We want to know about your experiences, but we don't want anyone to, we just don't want to introduce bias. And we also don't want to make people uncomfortable. So some of these things are matters that, you might regard as personal or not relevant to your medical school application. And so we don't talk about them unless you bring it up in the conversation, and then sure. These are the other secret instructions we give. So this is not every single medical school. This is just what BU School of Medicine does. But I figured I'd show you because I don't think we're that atypical. In our school, we do a single faculty interview. Different schools do different interview styles. That is kind of semi-structured, as you can see. So we have things that we have specific topics that we always cover. And so the first thing is to read every word of the application. So our interviewers are actually the biggest reviewers of your application. The initial screening to decide who gets an interview is much quicker than that. People spend 10 minutes with your application, but the interviewer usually reads it for it takes I don't know, a long time, half an hour to read the whole thing. And then the AIR that I wrote there, the AAIR, that is the Applicant Assessment and Interview Report. And so that's basically the sort of long online report that we use to evaluate each applicant. And so we suggest that our interviewers complete some of that before the interview actually happens, in part because it actually helps you get to know the application and figure out what some of the questions you're going to ask are. So here's the basic structure of our interviews. First of all, they're conversational. We really don't want them to be like question, answer, question, answer, question. It's very boring. We want to have a conversation, and we try to make it feel like a conversation. But on the other hand, we do want these topics to be covered. So I usually suggest that people start with kind of like an easy icebreaker question, and it should be something that's a little like, I don't know, something that's a softball. A lot of times I ask people like, oh, so why did you choose to go to Boston College? Or why did you choose your particular major? Or it could be something about, their activities. It used to be in pre-COVID times that if people were not from Boston, I would ask them like if they'd ever been to Boston before and if they were planning on seeing, anything besides the school or things like that. So just something easy. Then I ask about the clarifications. So that's what I was mentioning before. If there are any things we're trying to understand a little bit better about people's motivation or their path, their trajectory to medicine. Then we pose an ethical dilemma. And I'll talk more about that again in a minute. And then the other one is that we ask one or more questions that probe some sort of weaknesses or unanswered questions in the application. And I'll just say a bit more about that. So I mentioned, I think that poor performance is something that we might ask about. Sometimes it's other things. It's like if a person has been involved in lots of activities and they've basically been the president of every activity that they've done, then I start to wonder like, okay, is this person are they going to have trouble when they're on the bottom of the hierarchy? And like, how do they work in a team? So then sometimes we ask some questions about teamwork and things like that. So if it seems like, there's something that people haven't done a lot of, sometimes we'll push on that a little bit. And then finally, we give people a chance to ask questions. And, I encourage the interviewers to do that. And then we ask them to finish writing up their report, fill out the error as soon as they can, because otherwise they'll forget all the details, and we really want all the information in there. All right, so just a bit about ethical questions. First of all, ethical questions are not about your ethics. So we really are not trying to suss out if you agree with anyone, with your interviewer or the prevailing view or anything about any particular questions. Ethical questions give us a chance for you to demonstrate your critical thinking. And so we want to know, if there's a complicated issue, can you see different perspectives? Do you stop with just two, or do you try to find a whole bunch of different perspectives? Can you follow like a logical path of thinking? If you say, oh, well, on the one hand, you might do this because, then do you say, and also because, and sort of follow it down? We're looking to see if you demonstrate empathy. So a lot of times ethical dilemmas are examples of people acting in a way that they shouldn't because they're in a difficult spot. And so we're interested to see, like, can you imagine how people might be feeling, all the people involved might be feeling? We also look to see if you can kind of begin to solve the problem. So what did you do in this situation, or what would you do? And then a big thing for me is if you sought additional information. So, there's a reason that hospitals have whole ethics consult teams. It's because these are really difficult decisions, and complicated, difficult decisions are best made by teams of people. And so we want to know if your inclination when you're faced with a tricky problem is just to like give an answer or stick to your guns, or whether it's to try and find as much information as you possibly can and consider, like asking additional people for their advice. Okay, and then I have a few of my personal favorite interview questions. I'll just put these up on the screen. What's the most interesting thing you've learned? What medical problem would you fix? What'll be the hardest part of medical school? This is kind of for fun. What's the best work you've ever done? Could be anything. That's one of my favorites. And then, has anyone ever told you no? Sometimes that one's a favorite of mine, because a lot of times medical school applicants are people that are so accomplished it seems like they have been sailing through life unfettered. And I sometimes wonder, like, my goodness, has anyone ever told you you couldn't do something, and what happened then? So anyway, that's just some food for thought. And there's time for questions, but I guess maybe we're going to do that at the end. But so I will stop there and unshare myself. There we go.
Great. Thank you so much. That was incredible. I don't know how I'm going to follow that, but I'm going to chat a little bit just about my experience as a recent applicant to medical school. I don't have any fancy PowerPoint, so it's just going to be our faces for a little bit. But like Angela mentioned, I graduated from Boston College in 2019 and then started medical school in the fall of 2019, so a few months after graduation. So I didn't take any gap years, which is not the norm, so please don't feel like because that's what I'm talking about or that was my experience that that's the way to do it. People take many different paths to medical school, and I don't think there's a right or wrong way to do it. And we can talk more about that if people have questions about that. But I applied to medical schools after my junior year. I had taken the MCAT during my junior year, and I spent that summer between my junior and senior year working on secondaries, and I started hearing back from schools towards the end of the summer. So I applied to a lot of schools. Looking back, I think I applied to too many schools. I applied to 36 medical schools. I would not recommend that. It's really, really expensive, and I was just really scared that I wasn't going to get in anywhere. So I was like, let me apply as broadly as possible. I think that was too many because I got really burnt out by the end of the summer. It's too many essays and too many schools to keep track of. But I got 8 interview invites. I ended up saying no to 3 of them, and I went on 5 of them. And 2 of those 5 were in the MMI format, which is the mini medical interview. So it's a series of different it's a circuit of different interviewers. You'll be in one room for 6 minutes and you shift over to another room with another interviewer. So 2 of my interviews were like that, and 3 were traditional, so much more conversational, just sitting with 1 or 2 interviewers. But all 5 of those interviews consisted of some ethical conversation or an ethical dilemma or something of that sort. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of how I prepared for my interviews going in. And I'm not going to talk about any specific questions I received. I'm not allowed to do that, but I can talk about specific questions I prepared beforehand, and kind of what my experience was like in terms of my mental energy, what I was surprised by on my interview day, and things like that. So the beginning of my interview process, I was just like really excited to even get to that point of the process. So if you get to that point of the process, which I'm sure you all will because you're all spending your Tuesday night here with us, it's a really big accomplishment, something to be really excited about. And as much as you're trying to impress the school, they also, like we mentioned before, are trying to impress you too. So remember that, like, you were picked for a reason. That's really exciting. So don't try and be someone else. Don't try and come up with all these crazy answers. Just kind of reflect on who you are, why you're in this part, why you're trying to go to medical school. And I think that is the number one thing that you can do when preparing for your interviews, is just reflecting on your path, reflecting on why did you apply to medical school? Why do you want to go to that school specifically that you're interviewing at? And I think that that is something BC specifically actually set me up very, very well for, because we already focus so much on reflection. And I think that for a lot of students going into interviews, this was the first time they were asked some of those tough questions. They hadn't really sat back and reflected on some of their service opportunities or why they want to become a doctor, not just for the sake of becoming a doctor, but like we talk about at BC, being a man or woman for others, and kind of all those conversations that we have from day one at BC. For me, when I walked into my interviews, I had already had a lot of those conversations already with my professors or my classmates or peers or mentors. So I think that that's something really important. So don't shy away from that when you are exposed to those types of conversations at BC. It's really good to reflect. And I think that rather than memorizing random facts about the schools you're applying to or anything like that, the number one thing you can do is just sit back and think, what are the most important things that I've done the past few years? How have they helped me become the person I am today? And how will they help me in the future in my path in medicine? So that is something that I did before each of my interviews. I sat down and I actually made a list of the most important things I had done while at BC or outside of BC. And that's something you kind of will already have done in the application process, but for me, just jotting it down was important. And I wrote down just like skills or things that I had taken away from those experiences. So anytime that I was asked a question on an interview, I could immediately kind of pull from that little note sheet that I had made of different experiences I had had. So that's something I think that was someone had told me before I interviewed, and I think that really helped me, is whenever you're asked a question, if you can pull a personal anecdote, that really helps, because that way you can show your qualities and skills rather than just tell them, like, instead of just saying like, oh, I'm dependable or I'm organized, you can show them that you've done that through your experiences, whether it's working in a team, being a leader, volunteering, whether it's you having a challenge and failing, anything like that. If you can talk about an experience that shows that you demonstrate those qualities, that's so much better than just listing off different facts and things. So really thinking about the different things that you've done and what matters to you is really important. And one more thing in terms of just like general interviews, I think that really being honest with yourself and the interviewer is really important. They, want to know you. They want to know who you are as a person. They're trying to take people who are actual people and not the pre-med robots that we all try and avoid. So don't try and fake who you are. Don't try and make things sound fancier than they were. Just be honest. For example, like, I always get excited talking about this random camp that I volunteered at throughout my summers back home. It's a summer camp. And while a lot of my classmates from BC were doing internships at MGH and doing all these really fancy things with professors and doctors, I spent most of my summers just volunteering with kids, doing like Mentos and Coke bottle experiments and things like that. But that's what I really enjoy to do. And I don't even remember the question, but I remember I was talking about this camp experience to one of my interviewers, and the timer went off. It was an MMI, so I was at a time. And I said to her, I was like, I'm so sorry I ran out of time. Like, I just get so excited talking about this camp. And I wish I could really like put into words how much this means to me. I wish I had more time to explain myself. And she said to me, you don't need to explain it any further. I can see from the excitement in your eyes how much this thing means to you. And there was nothing I could have done to prepare for that moment or really like come up with a really fancy story about this experience. But it was just the fact that like, when I'm asked to talk about something I care about, I picked things that I really did care about. And it didn't matter that it wasn't a really fancy thing or that it didn't have a cool name to it, but it was something that meant a lot to me. So be honest with yourself and the interviewers, because that will come through. And if you're talking about things you like, your real personality will come out too, and they'll appreciate that. It also helped me feel less stifled. It helped me feel less awkward when I was talking about things that I was really comfortable with. So that's something I think that's really important to remember. And I think that helped me a lot feel like myself on interview days. And then specifically talking about ethics cases, something that I think was important that a professor at BC had actually told me was, when given any question in terms of like ethics situations or would you do this or that, I think an important thing to remember is there's not always a right answer. They want to see that you can see both sides of the situation. And so what my friend was also applying to medical schools. Once a week, we would sit down in the month that leading up to our interviews, and we kind of just Googled like ethics questions, and you can find them anywhere really, and you'll find a wide variety of them. And I was scared kind of going into it like, oh, what if they ask me about public policy or about like insurance or Medicare for all? I was like, I don't know what I'm going to say. I don't want to get political. I don't have the knowledge that a lot of people have going in. And a lot of the questions that I found had nothing to do with that. They were asking about just random situations and scenarios that you might get as a medical student or as a physician one day. And you don't really need, at least from my experience from the questions that I was practicing with, I didn't need any background knowledge of like ethics or public health or anything like that going in. I just needed an open mind. So my friend and I would try and come up with a way for us to explain that we could see both sides of the situation. So I'd say, like, I understand that a patient might want to do this, but I also need to understand this viewpoint, or that a patient might be going through this experience rather than this one. So not trying to find a yes or no answer, which is hard because we all think in this really methodical science way, not trying to find the right answer, but showing that you might have an opinion here, but you can see both sides of the situation and that you recognize that. And just voicing that, I think, is so important. So whatever answers you come up with, let them know that you understand your patient is coming from a different situation than you might be, or whatever the situation might be. Even if it's not medical necessarily with the patient, there's always 2 or 3 or 4 sides to a situation. There's so many different answers. So show that you can be creative and you're not kind of just a tunnel vision, narrow-minded person. And then one more thing in terms of just what I did in general, besides preparing for ethics cases in that way, like looking through questions with a friend, I did a few mock interviews with a friend of mine. I gave her a list of random questions I had Googled that I saw that medical schools frequently asked, and I sat down with her and she just did little mock interviews with me. And I don't think that those are essential. I don't think that I was prepared any better for answering the questions, but for me, it just kind of got my nerves out and it kind of let me just relax a little bit. And I think that that's good because me being someone who like wasn't in the business school or anything like that, I hadn't really done a ton of formal interviews before. It was my first time like putting on a suit and going and doing something like this. So just kind of getting the fear out of it and doing it with someone I was comfortable with really helped me out. So that's kind of an overview of how I prepared for my interviews. And during them, again, I just tried to forget about the numbers and all of those scary things about medical school and the application process. And it's hard, but I kept reminding myself, like, I'm here for a reason. And imposter syndrome is very real in this process, but remind yourself when you're at that point, like the school picked you for a reason. You have all the answers in your head because they're just going to ask you about you. They just want to know who you are. No one knows that better than you. So trust yourself and trust the process. And if for some reason you don't click with an interviewer, you don't click with the school, that's okay. You don't want to be stuck at a place where you're not a good fit. You want to be somewhere where you can connect really well. So on those interview days, I was not just trying to like show the schools that they should take me, but I was also testing the schools. Like, would I be happy here? Can I connect with these students? Because medical school is very challenging and you want to be somewhere where you're happy. So that's kind of my word of advice for during the interview day, and reminding all of that kind of helped me stay grounded throughout the interview days. And now kind of just looking back, or kind of my position now in this process, I help Tulane with interviews. A lot of our classmates, we are all student interviewers, so we have students come in, the interviewers, and we sit with them over lunch and we talk to them, and the school gives us a list of questions to ask them. And the main thing that I always think about after those interviews, like I try and keep in my head, okay, like what did they answer for that question? What did they say for that question? But my main thing is like, did I have fun talking to that person? Could I see that person being my lab partner or being one of my classmates I'd go and have study groups with and things like that? So that's my main thing. And whenever I write evaluations for students after interviews, those are the things that I focus on the most. And I've also done some virtual interviews now in the time of COVID over Zoom, and it's definitely less fun because the person's not there in front of me, but the same things apply. I'm looking for the same thing. Like, did the person actually take an interest in the school and take an interest in getting to know me? Did they seem genuine? Were they actually able to have a conversation? And if I was a patient, would they be someone that I would want to go and talk to? So that's kind of from now, like a student interviewer perspective, what my experience has been like. But I can go on and on about these different experiences and things like that, but I'm going to stop here, and please ask me any questions you have at the end of this session.
Great, and I will take it from here, and I do have some slides that I will share. So just give me one moment. And so let's see. Okay, perfect. So I'll get started from here. So again, for those of you who may have come in a few minutes late, my name is Kayla Pelland. I'm an assistant director in the BC Career Center, and in my role, I oversee the science, technology, and engineering cluster. But I've also, for the past several months, have been assisting on an interim basis with healthcare and nursing as well. And the perspective that I bring to this conversation is a little bit different. So I will be sharing virtual interviewing tips and best practices, definitely from a more general standpoint. But that being said, I think that much of the information will still be applicable to medical schools. And so before I get into my presentation, I just wanted to share a little bit of information about our office. So at the BC Career Center, our mission is to really empower students from all different academic disciplines to incorporate their career goals into sort of a broader sense of living a life of meaning and impact. And so really everything that we do revolves around the mission that students will be empowered to pursue meaningful careers and lives. And so really what that means is that we work with all students regardless of what they study and what their background is. We also really want to make sure that students feel confident in being able to explore, prepare, and also act on their career goals. And so particularly for this presentation, I did want to let the pre-health students who are watching this know that you do have access to the Career Center's healthcare and nursing cluster, and that really provides you with a community of like-minded peers, specialized coaching, and also some resources to support you on your journey. So please keep that in mind. So when it comes to virtual interviewing, again, this perspective is going to be a bit more general, but what we've seen in recent years is that an increasing number of organizations are choosing to adopt video-enabled interviews as part of their recruitment process. And this is also true, of course, of medical schools and their admissions process. And so there are several reasons why organizations have made the decision to start using video interviews. And to just give you a few examples, they reduce travel costs, they shorten the time it makes to take a hire, and it also helps employers reach candidates from other geographic regions. And then in the case of medical schools, as we know, a pandemic hit, so that is the situation that we are now facing. And so when it comes to video interviewing, there's two types. One is pre-recorded video interviewing or one-way video interviewing. And a few different examples of those platforms are HireVue, Spark Hire, Interview Stream. And this is a situation where an interviewer would not be present. A candidate would actually be asked to respond to questions that are pre-recorded, and then those responses are recorded for a reviewer to review at a later point. And then we also have live video interviewing, which is two-way. And so some examples of platforms there would be Zoom, Google Hangouts, or Skype. And this is a situation where you would be interviewed by an interviewer. So again, it's going to be conversational here. And you would be, in a situation where you're given questions, you're also asking questions. So again, very conversational. And so for these two different types of virtual interviewing, many best practices still apply, but there are a few key differences that I do want to review. The first is particularly for pre-recorded video interviewing or one-way. So the first here, of course, test your technology. I think this is a great way to showcase your digital technology skills. So, making sure that your battery is fully charged or you're plugged into a power source, making sure you have a secure internet connection as well, of course, will be important here. Ensure any software or program updates have already been taken care of, and also making sure to log in 10 to 15 minutes early to just, again, ensure that there won't be any technical difficulties. You'll also want to make sure that you pick the right location. So find a place that has good lighting, is quiet, and minimizes distractions. And be conscientious of what's visible in terms of your interview attire, what your background is, any items that might be displayed. So definitely try to strive for a neutral and a professional background. You also want to dress for success. So dress the same way for a virtual interview as you would in person. Business casual attire in most cases is appropriate, but you can also ask admissions committees or future employers what would be appropriate in that setting. Make sure you're paying attention to body language. So, of course, what you say always matters during virtual interviews, but also, take notice of your nonverbal body language and be sure to have good posture and limit movements as you're being interviewed. Make sure to look at the camera and not the screen. And I know this can feel a bit awkward, but you essentially want to try to simulate eye contact. And so try practicing a few times with this to make sure you feel comfortable. Also, make sure you're taking it slow. This is particularly important for pre-recorded interviews because you want to make sure that you're speaking slowly enough that the reviewer is able to, accurately hear what you're trying to share with them. You could also use earphones to minimize static or any background noise. And I think, this is, of course, obvious here, practice is going to be the key to success. So try recording yourself either on your phone or your computer ahead of time before doing a final recording, and make sure that you're really comfortable with this process. And then finally, just know what your software and employer, or in this case, medical school guidelines are. You really want to make sure that you are following what has been shared with you, and the basics of the whatever it is, the interview software that you're using. So just be mindful of that. And then live video interviewing, again, this is two-way conversational with another person. Some of the same best practices, but a few differences to sort of note here. So again, practice is really going to be the key to success here, making sure you're comfortable with the technology. Definitely making sure you're taking it just as seriously as you would an in-person interview. Make sure you follow all of those same sort of pre-interview routines that you normally would if it would be for an in-person interview. So, of course, performing some detailed research ahead of time, making sure you're getting a good night's sleep, and really making sure you're dressing the part as well. You also, again, want to control your environment, so just making sure that you have a quiet, distraction-free space will be very important here. In terms of optimizing your space, just making sure that any physical or digital documents that you might need are within easy access for you, removing anything that could be easily distracting, and again, technology skills here, making sure you have a power source, you're having a strong Wi-Fi connection, and all of that. So I think what's important about live video interviewing is don't forget that you're speaking with a human being. I think, what's going to be really important is just making sure that the technology doesn't get in the way of that conversation, and really make sure that the communication that you're having allows your personality to shine through a bit. And then finally, be mindful again of your body language, maintaining appropriate eye contact, just being aware of your sort of nonverbal cues to your interviewer. So in terms of some resources to help you prepare, BC does actually give free access to students with this platform called Big Interview. And I think what's really cool about this is if you log in, you're able to record yourself answering sample medical school questions. And you can also access their library of resources, including videos on interview strategies. And this is a really easy way to just kind of set up your account. You can just visit bc.biginterview.com. And then from there, you'll be able to sort of get walked through what your different options are for practicing. I think the BC Pre-Health program is also a really great resource. So, conducting simulated mock interviews for students and alums. But I think what's important to note here is that they only do it for those who have already been scheduled for official interview dates with Health Professions Graduate School. So do keep that in mind, that you should not, schedule an appointment until you have an official interview set up. And then finally, in terms of resources, of course, BC Career Center is a great one on campus. We do have career cluster coaches who are available to conduct virtual practice interviews that are based on your industry of interest. And so, as many of you are probably pre-health students, healthcare and nursing would be the coach that you want to go to, and you can schedule any of those appointments on Handshake. And then one tip I just wanted to share is that the Career Center actually allows students to reserve quiet space for virtual interviews. And I think, now more than ever, it's important to be able to offer that for students. And so all you have to do is just contact us at this email address listed here and just let us know the date and the time that you would need space. And then finally, I just wanted to point out that the Association of American Medical Colleges has a really comprehensive packet full of information about virtual interviews, and also includes tips for medical school applicants. So do keep that in mind as well. And so finally, I'll just wrap it up with inviting you all to connect with us. So, given the current situation with COVID-19, of course, keeping the health and safety of our community is really top priority. So we're not currently seeing students in person, but you're certainly welcome to schedule a virtual appointment with us, whether it be practice interview. If you have other questions sort of about like the medical school application process, we're certainly happy to help. And so we have a number of ways that you can contact us listed here. And with that, I will go ahead and get wrapped up.
Thank you to all three of you. Those were all great presentations. We already do have a lot of questions. I don't know can the panelists all see them? Yeah. So we can start with, what sort of questions, if any, should an applicant try to ask during an interview?
So yes, you should definitely have a couple of questions prepared to ask, because every interviewer is going to ask at the end of your conversation, what questions do you have? And if you don't have any, that's not good. They're going to think you're not interested. So have some. And I think the best questions are questions that show that you, it's good to ask questions that show that you've thought about the school a little bit, that you're trying to picture yourself there, that you're interested in the kinds of work you could do. But it's also good to ask questions. And so that would be, you might ask about, whatever, if it depends a little bit on who's interviewing you, but you might ask about, for example, if there are research opportunities, or how students usually go about finding mentors. If a lot of students have kind of informal mentors among the faculty, or something like that. One word of caution is that if you ask very specific questions, it's entirely possible, even likely, that your interviewer won't know the answer. And that's because different interviewers have different backgrounds and they have different roles in the hospital. And so if you ask somebody who really is doing most of their teaching in the clinical setting, for example, is an internal medicine doctor and is teaching in the hospital and the wards. If you're asking questions about, you know, whether or not nutrition is incorporated into the preclinical curriculum, they just might not know that answer. It's a little specific, right? Or if you have sometimes people ask me very specific questions about, you know, like student run activities, and I don't know all of the things about them. So, so very specific questions you might not get an answer. I am actually a big fan of general questions that the person where you ask the person for their impression. So in other words, asking them what's their favorite thing about working at, you know, BU or Boston Medical Center in my case, asking people what they, you know, what would they change about medical education if they could change, something like that. Not in general, but like at the school. You know, what's the thing that sometimes people ask me a variation of, like, what's the worst thing about BU School of Medicine, or, you know, what's the one thing you would change if you could? And I think actually that's a great question. Yeah, so I would do that. I think asking people questions that show that you're interested, and asking people questions about like their impression of the school, because you can only get that information by asking questions. You can't get it from a website or anything like that. So that's what I would suggest.
Another question was, do any of the panelists have any advice for how to approach team activities that are part of the interview?
So I can speak to that a little bit. I had, I believe, 1 or 2 interviews where we had some team-based activity, and I was an applicant, so I don't know, like, from the interviewer's point of view what they were looking for. But as an applicant, I think that it was important for me to just be like genuine and be real, like thinking about how I worked like in chemistry labs in a team or things like that. There were a few applicants to me that stood out in my groups who it felt very, very forced and not so genuine, who were really like hyper aware that they were being assessed. And I could tell as someone working on their team that they were not being genuine. Like, I would give them some input on like the problem we were working on. They were like, thank you for your input. I appreciate your presence. And it to me was just really like, I was like, that's not how you talk to people. So I was trying to not be fake and just work really hard to pretend like, okay, how would I work like at BC if I was on an e-board or on a team or anything like that, and just like actually focus on whatever problem it is you're trying to solve or whatever activity you're doing. Just be present. I think if I was an interviewer watching that, I would want the students who are showing me how they would act in real life in groups. And I think that for me, that also just made the activities more enjoyable. And I felt like I was more productive when I wasn't so hyper aware that like, oh my gosh, I'm being assessed right now. It's just like, okay, let me help this person I'm sitting next to. Let's work through this problem or do this activity. So that was my word of advice. I'd say don't try and be that person who's being really, really fake. It's just not fun for anyone.
Another question is, a lot of people are wondering about the biggest mistakes that you guys have seen interviewers make, or interviewees.
I think let's see, some of the biggest mistakes. Okay, you need to be really, really familiar with everything on your application, which I think seems like it should be a very easy thing to do, but that AMCAS application has a long list of experiences, and you know, everybody knows you're supposed to like put in lots of stuff. So I think that leads people sometimes to put things in there that weren't really big, I don't know, that they don't remember all that well, or that actually weren't that big of an influence. And it's okay to put it on the list, but make sure you review it before your interview, because it's likely that somebody will think it's interesting and ask you about it. And if you can't talk about it easily, then that's not going to look good. So an example would be like, you know, maybe you've done, I don't know, 3 or 4 different research experiences, and one of the ones was like a fairly short term, maybe it was kind of introductory level, but it just so happens that it's connected to what the interviewer knows about and is interested in. They're likely to ask you about it. And even if that's like way back in your memory from the summer after freshman year, like, you should be prepared to talk about it. And if you don't remember all the ins and outs of the science, that's fine. You can say like, oh, that was actually my first introduction to being in the lab, and it really made me, you know, even though I was really just learning techniques, it made me want to do more and get to a deeper level with the science. Like something like that would be fine. And then people will back off and not ask you a million questions about like its relevance in the current literature. But you got to be prepared to at least talk about things a little bit. That's a big mistake. And I think the other biggest thing that we have that actually comes across as a poor interview is when people wait to be asked a question. So if somebody asks you a question and you give an answer, like they're trying to have a conversation with you. So if somebody says, so I guess I would say, you know, answer the question, but in a way that leaves it open so that you can kind of have a back and forth, as opposed to just answering the question, giving an answer that you had planned on, and then being like, and sitting back and waiting, right? Like that seems like you don't know how to have a conversation with someone. So that's the other thing I can think of.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I think it's not necessarily a mistake, but when someone's sitting there and I'm just like really pulling teeth to like get things out of them or like have a conversation with them, I feel so sad as an interviewer because they have all these accomplishments. They have this wonderful like set of resume and all these things, and they just like can't have a conversation. And to me, like, even if they have the highest scores, like I wouldn't want a classmate or a doctor who like is making me feel uncomfortable or I can't talk to. So I always tell people, like, think of an interview, the level of formality that you would have with your typical BC professor. I know at BC, a lot of students get to know professors, you talk to them regularly. So if you go to lunch with your professor, go to office hours with them, like, yes, you're going to be formal and you're going to try and be, you know, professional, but you still can have a conversation with them. You can laugh a little bit, you can smile, you're a little bit at ease. But with that comes my second biggest mistake I've seen is when people get too casual. Have had one or two students who have sworn on during the interview or things like that. And it's like, yes, I want you to feel comfortable and have a conversation, but still like respect the fact that this is an interview and this is something you care about, and don't take it that far. So finding that middle ground, that's why I say, think about what you would be like talking to a professor. You wouldn't do that with them, but you know, you want to be yourself, you want to be kind and light, but you also respect the situation and kind of give it that level of professionalism.
I'll also just add briefly, again, this is sort of like a general comment, but I think it can be applicable here. If you're given a behavioral type of interview question and you're unable to back it up with concrete evidence about an experience that you've had, it can really weaken your response. And so I often find students having a tough time sort of connecting their experiences to interview questions. And so I do a lot of coaching around not only thinking about how to answer it in terms of the framework for that, but how can we really reflect on the experiences that you've had and connect them in a meaningful way, whether it be to an employer or, in this case, a medical school admissions committee.
I'll also just throw in, it's actually better if you are telling us stories that do not appear in your application. It's fine if you're answering a question and you might say something, you know, sometimes I ask people about a, I don't know. Sometimes I'll ask people about a patient experience that they had. And if they tell me about the patient that they wrote about in their application, then I tend to think that their experience is really limited. So it's better, it's okay, as I said, it's okay to connect things. You might say like, oh, actually, I really learned a lot about such and such when I was doing this, you know, like medical brigade trip or whatever. Like that's fine to say that, but you don't want to like reiterate things that are written down.
And then another question was how to keep things conversational over Zoom. If you have any advice for that.
You know, that's a good question. I think what I would say is my experience so far, and we actually we started this in the spring because we have some special pathways where we have programs with our undergrad institution, and so we were doing interviews in the spring as well for those programs and over Zoom, and it actually is fine. I feel like it's fine. Like you can just have a conversation. The only thing that's harder, if you have a group situation like we are in right now, sometimes people talk over each other and that's hard. It's usually entirely unintentional. But if it's just two people, you usually can kind of do it.
Yeah, I haven't had many issues with that. I think the main thing is that people feel less inclined to make it conversational. It's kind of what we were saying earlier, like they answer the question, like sit back. And so I think like with just one-on-one, it's harder to talk over each other. Like that won't happen. So like be okay with just having a conversation. I know it's hard, but like pretend like they're in front of you. And like there were a few moments where like the interview accidentally like we talked at the same time, but I was more than happy to just like let them talk because we want to hear from the interviewee. So like keep talking, ask questions like you normally would. Just because it's online doesn't mean it needs to be any more formal or anything like that. Like I walk away from interviews thinking they went well if I was like laughing and smiling and actually interested. So try and keep that up even on Zoom. Like, it is harder, but we still are looking for that conversation.
And then I think we have time for one last question. For an ethical dilemma, would you like to see your interviewees bringing in the whole thinking process and describing it and identifying each perspective and possible path, or just kind of quickly answering the question?
No, I think ethical dilemmas are ones that invite a longer conversation. I mean, that's actually a really good time to have a conversation. And I would say that I pretty much always want people to say more. I don't think that I've ever thought that somebody has just really gone off the rails and is talking too much about an ethical dilemma. It usually goes the other way, that people say, they'll sort of say like on this hand, but on the other hand, and then they kind of stop. And so I would err on the side of saying more. If your interviewer is starting to nod off, then maybe change the subject, but that shouldn't happen. And I saw somebody type to like, are there any red flags in interviews that would make you run away from the school? And I would say like, yeah, if your interviewer is nodding off, you should skip that one.
Yeah, I'd agree if when I'm asking a question, if I can like see the thought process, sometimes like that's more interesting to me than their actual answer for the question. Just like I can actually get to know them. And I think also like when you're thinking out loud, kind of that helps me get to know you better. It feels less rehearsed. So yeah, I think that I always prefer that.
Okay, so I think we are out of time for today. On behalf of all of us participants and students, thank you to our 3 panelists. I know, at least for myself, this has been really helpful, and I'm sure everyone else agrees. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you. It was my pleasure.
Mine as well. Thanks, Angela.